Hey guys, what is tidal bass fishing? A lot of you don't know what tidal bass fishing, and a lot of you do. Today I'm going to take some time to lay out the basics of tidewater bassing. First, let's understand what tide is. The tide is when coastal waters are affected by the moon or the wind that change the level of the water, depending on the moon phase, from higher to lower, depending on your region on the coast. This could be as little as 6 inches or a foot of tide difference between low water, low tide, and high tide, or it could be a difference of 7 or 8 feet. A lot of places, even more way north. But generally way north, you're not dealing with bass, you're dealing with some other species. So that's what the tide is. Low water tends to concentrate the fish, concentrate the bait, shrink the water source down, make the fish more accessible. High water tends to dilute the fish, dilute the bait, make the fish less accessible in most situations. Now, what the tide does is it creates predictable feeding windows. Predictable feeding windows. Kind of like if you're fishing a lake, a lot of you guys would check the salooner tables to see what the major and minor feeding activity time would be for that day. On a tidal influenced body of water, the salooner table plays a small part, but the tide is the most important part. The fish feed on the tide. That's their dinner bell. That's their time to feed. It overrides the salooner tables in most situations. So speaking of feeding windows, let's discuss what the feeding windows are. The first feeding window, and probably the feeding window that most people who fish tidewaters would concentrate on mostly, would be the falling or lower water outgoing tide towards low tide, usually about the last 2 hours of low tide. And let's not forget this, a tide cycle generally runs about 6 hours between high and low tide. So you'll have high tide, low tide, low tide, generally in a 24, 25 hour time a day. The tide advances about an hour a day. So if it was 2 o'clock today, it's going to be about 3 o'clock tomorrow. Really, it's more like 50 minutes, but an hour makes it simple in your mind to get it close anyhow. So the first feeding window, low falling water, that's when you're going to catch the most fish, generally speaking. Like I said, and I've said it in the past, and I'll probably say it again, you can catch a fish at any time, anywhere, on any tide, any time of the year, but generally speaking, the best time to catch the most fish on a tidal river would be that last 2 hours of outgoing water. Why is that again? Well, what we talked about, it shrinks the playing field down. It brings the fish out of the flats, out of the creeks, out of the ditches, all the places that had 3, 4, 5 foot of water in it, maybe at high tide, that might either go dry or have a couple inches of water in it at low tide. So the fish obviously can't stay there. So they leave there and they concentrate for 2 reasons. Self-preservation, they don't want to get landlocked. And the bait also doesn't want to get landlocked. So what that does is that creates everything in the ecosystem starts to move out to outside edges, to places where are easily accessible for you to cast a lure to the fish. So that puts the fish in front of where you can fish in a smaller area. So that's obviously going to make that the best time to fish generally. One other thing that the falling low water does is the water tends to clear up that last 2 hours because the tide has been, at high tide it's still, and then it starts to pick up speed. And about halfway out, the speed is maximum. At this time, the water's getting turbid, stirred up, the silt's getting stirred up, the water's dirty, the fish are less likely to feed on dirty water, especially when they know what's coming, because they live in it 24 hours a day. They know, okay, when this tide slows down, the water's going to clear up. I'll be able to see my prey easier, and it'll be easier for me to catch them, in addition to the fact that they're coming out. So that's window number one, generally considered the best window. That's the best, in my opinion, that's the best window for catching the most fish most of the time. But that's not the best window for catching the better fish. The better fish are generally caught, the bigger fish, the bigger than average fish, in my experience, are generally caught in window 2 or window 3. Window 2 is still low water, but the tide has turned and it has started coming up. What does that do? Well, the first thing that it does is it tends to, after everything has kind of found its way this way, and then the tide turns around and goes back the other way, it loosens everything up again. Where the bait may have came out and they got hidden in a log or whatnot, or they're hiding from the bass, the tide tends to reflush everything. The fish have to change position. A bass has to change position from, he was facing into the tide on the outgoing tide, so now he's got to find a place to face into the tide on the incoming tide. It just moves again. The whole ecosystem has to move, start moving again. And it tends to, with incoming tide, the water tends to dirty up pretty quickly. And that does two things for the bigger bass who are more wary. It gives them a little bit more cover with a little bit dirtier water. Now, I'm not talking about muddy water. I'm just talking about a little dirtier water. And it tends to give them more water, which gives them security. So the bigger fish will generally hang out until that tide starts to come in, and then they'll rush up to the edge as the tide comes up and feed on the bait that's trying to get back away from them again, up onto the flats or the little ditches or creeks or places that they like to get during higher water. And that window usually lasts about an hour most of the time, sometimes a little bit more. Like I said, so that's generally when I catch better than average fish. If you're catching 1.5 pound fish on the last 2 hours of outgoing tide, excuse me, you'll still catch some of those fish, but then you'll start to mix into 2 to 2.5 to 3 pound fish. Now, window number 3 of the 3 major feeding windows, in my experience, is the high tide turn. Tide's been coming in, the fish fed at the bottom of the tide for a little while, and then you got 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 hours where it's going to be very difficult to catch a fish because they're just not where they were at low tide. They've gone to another place completely. They've followed the bait up onto the flats. Tide comes up, bait moves up, fish move up. Tide comes up, bait moves up, fish move up. They get away from where you can access them easily. And then after the water gets to a certain point, the bass realize, because they do it every day, obviously, they realize that, you know what, this is too difficult. There's too many places this bait can hide. This is just getting too difficult. And they go in a neutral mode until something changes. Something's got to change, right? So the next change is the high tide turn. Now, this is not a major feed generally. This is not the time when you're going to catch 15 or 20 keepers like you're going to catch on low outgoing tide, or 5 or 6 keepers like you're going to catch on low incoming tide. But you'll get generally a couple bites if you're doing the right thing. Reason being, again, the water slows down, stops, it again clears up again because it started getting muddy again on that water rushing in. And it clears up, changes directions, gets the fish thinking, including the bait, we got to make another move. So their whole life is in the tidal water system is move, 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 move. So the bait starts thinking about turning around and coming back out. Things start to again reposition to face into the current, depending on what's still out in the current. And everything starts moving again, and it fires that ecosystem up again. And generally, in my experience, a lot of times you'll catch the biggest bass of the day on this tide if you're doing the right thing. And the right thing changes depending on the season and the available habitat and whatnot. But the season. Now I'm going to talk about that coming up in the next couple of videos I'm going to do are going to be on tidal bass seasonal patterns. What do you do in the winter? What do you do pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, summertime, fall? There's really 5 seasons. There's winter, pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, summer, and fall. There's 6 seasons actually in all bass fishing, but tidal river fishing, it's a little bit different. Some of these seasons, the fish use a little bit different type areas. So we'll talk about that in some of my upcoming videos. So make sure you don't miss those. If you subscribe to my channel here, you'll be sure to get notified when they come up. So we talked about window 1, window 2, window 3. Now what do people do in a tidal river? The most important thing in a tidal river is not what you're fishing with or where you're fishing, but when you're there. That's the most important thing. If you can be on the best spot on the river, more tournaments won there, more fish caught there than any other spot, the community hole everybody knows about, the great spot. You can be on that spot. And you can sit there for 3 hours incoming and 3 hours outgoing, 6 hours, and never catch a fish. Never even get a bite. You won't think there's a fish within a mile of there. But if you're on that spot on the right tide, you can catch them. So the most important thing about tidal fishing is not the spot, it's the tide. And being most rivers are 20 to 300 miles long, some of them, you can run the tide. So once you get on the good tide, if you're down the river on outgoing tide, that's where the tide's going to be lowest first, you can fish that area until the tide starts coming in, the fish bite for a little bit, and then they stop. And then you fire it up and go and try to get up ahead of that tide again to where you're getting some more outgoing water, the clearer water, than that first part of incoming water where the bigger fish generally bite. It's called running the tide. And that's a very important thing to do in tidal water. Now, another thing about tide water that you have to understand is the fish are always going to be shallow. In most tidal rivers, with the exception of the dead of winter and some dredge holes or something like that, which we'll talk about, the fish are going to be in mostly 5 foot of water or less, but 8 foot of water or less 99.9% of the time. That's where they're going to be. That's where the oxygen is. That's where the bait is. There's out deep, you're getting out. There's no current breaks and things like that from the hide behinds. They're going to be around shore cover generally. Rivers are mostly shore cover. Mostly. Another important thing about tidal rivers you have to understand is you can catch them year round on a tide. You can catch them on a tidal river when it's 100 degrees out and full on sun, because a tidal river bass has a constant flow of oxygen in the summertime. Constant flow. They also have a constant flow of cool water coming out of shaded creeks and things like that. So for you guys that fish a lot of lakes and stuff in the summertime where, the tournaments are at night or whatnot, on a tidal river, you can fish them. You can fish all day long and catch. Now, the approach to tide water fishing is always fish with the current. Throw up current, let your bait come down. That's natural. That's the way the fish are going to see it as natural. If you do something different, you're not going to get as many bites. Can you catch them the other way? Sure you can. But you want to put yourself in a position to catch the most fish. Another thing that's very important about tidal water fishing is think small. Most tidewater bass feed on small bait. Now they will eat bigger bluegill and white perch and things usually, but rivers are full of small bait. Rivers are full of small crawfish. They're full of small bullhead minnows and small things. So small lures tend to do best on rivers, even rivers with big fish in them. Like I said, stay shallow, think small lures, stay with the best tide, always fish with the current, and consider best water quality. If you're in a place that's just always stirred up and muddy and mud bottom and never clears up good, doesn't have good water quality, they're the type of things you want to get away from. So let's talk about variables of tidewater fishing. First variable, tidewater fishing, which I'm going to talk about in my upcoming videos in more detail, is time of year. The time of year, that's gonna dictate where the fish are in the river. Another thing that a variable in tidewater is weather trends. And when I say weather trends, I'm talking about rain and wind generally. Rain, I believe, affects rivers more than it does lakes. I mean, even when you're in a lot of these lakes, you get rain. Up the river can get trashed, down in the lake will stay nice. Well, rivers can get trashed pretty quick with rain because that water's it's moving, it's pulling all that mud and junk down the river. So they can get trashed pretty quick. And the wind is another big weather issue on rivers, where in lakes, a good wind is a good thing. People look for, a good wind. That kind of fires the fish up, gives them cover. In a river, from my experience, in most rivers, the wind, chop is okay, but any amount of wind you want to stay away from in a river because it tends to stir up the river and make it silty, and the fish kind of move out and away from that. And what the wind can also do coastally, you've heard, wind from the east, fish bite least. Well, here on the East Coast where I live, an east wind, what does it do? An east wind pushes the ocean against the coast. Well, what's that do? It stops the water from going out. So you don't get the low tides that you need to get, and you'll get higher tides than you should get. So you're getting behind the 8 ball when the wind messes up the fish's environment. The wind slows down or speeds up the current, depending on the direction of the wind. Now, if the current moves really slow, especially in the summertime or the warmer weather, the fish, they're not going to bite as well. They just never bite as well. Like, we read tide charts around here, and say high tide is 3 feet above sea level and low tide is 0 feet. Well, on the days where high tide is 2.6 feet and low tide is 0.8 feet, smaller tide window, those are the worst days to fish in the summertime because you don't get the flow, which brings the oxygen in the food, and the fish just go, you know what, been here, done this, we're just going to chill for today. We're going to wait till conditions get a little bit better. So the wind can really, really mess you up in a river situation. And there's some adjustments you can make, which we'll talk about in seasonal patterns coming up. Salinity would be another factor that you have to consider in rivers. We're talking about being on coast, rivers that go into coastal bays or straight into the ocean or whatnot, which is all salt water. And depending on how much rain you get throughout the season, last year you may have caught them 5 miles farther down the river than you're going to catch them this year because you didn't get any rain. And then an exceptionally dry year, the fish will even move farther up the river, and that can really concentrate fish in the headwaters of the river when you get extremely dry years. And of course, when you get extremely wet years, the fish will spread way out farther down than, you know, people would think they would be sometimes. So these are variables that everybody needs to understand about rivers to help you catch more fish. You consider all these variables, and then you consider the available habitat. Again, in rivers, you have some different types of habitat than you do in lakes. You know, rivers tend to be more commercially oriented, all rivers, but especially tidal rivers. So you got a lot more marinas and bulkheads and dockage and dredge holes, and marinas have oxbow lakes, you know, old channels that don't operate the same way as the main river. And you got flats that go dry, and you got creeks that go dry, or creeks that hold water. So you got different type of habitat than you have in a lot of lakes. So considering the feeding windows, the advantages of fishing a river, the approach to fish rivers, the variables that can affect river fishing. One thing I do want to mention, I didn't mention, boat traffic is a major, major deal on rivers. Rivers are generally narrow. Some aren't. I mean, the Potomac River, for example, man, things like 5, 6, 7 miles wide in some places. But most rivers are generally narrow, so all the boats use the same lane. So if you get a lot of boat traffic in a river, it's gonna really, really muddy it up. So if you're fishing, you know, a Wednesday night tournament on the river in the summertime, you know, you might get a few guys out there water skiing after work or whatnot, but the boat traffic's not gonna be too bad. And you'll be able to catch fish on places on Wednesday that you won't be able to catch those fish on Saturday or Sunday, because that boat traffic is going to muddy up your stuff as the tide drops. See, because as the tide drops, the bank is exposed, and then the boat wakes stir the mud up that's exposed on the bank, and then that ends up in the river. So you go pre-fishing on a Wednesday, don't necessarily expect to be able to catch those fish on Saturday unless it's like a morning thing before that boat activity gets out there. And of course, you got a bunch of tournament boats on the tournament day too that could be running around muddying things up, and it's a whole different environment for the fish. You know, on Wednesday they hear, you know, a couple boats go by here or there, and it doesn't really muddy the water up. And then on Saturday and Sunday, and you got 50 boats out there fishing and 50 pleasure boats out there running the river. You got 100 boats running up and down the river, you know, on a busy weekend day. You just can't expect to catch those same fish at the same tide. So that comes into play big time too. So that's a basic synopsis of tidal river bass fishing. I'm going to be doing videos, like I said, on seasonal patterns of tidal water bass fishing. And I'm also going to continue to do some videos on techniques and tactics, generalizations of pre-spawn and post-spawn and things like that. I'm also fishing the Bass Eastern Opens again this year, and I'm going to do some tournament recaps for you also on that. So if you like my content, please hit the like button. If you like my content enough that you think you want to watch it on a regular basis, and it's something that you can, you feel like you can learn from me, please hit the subscribe button. If you find the video very important, like I did some videos on safety, cold water safety and whatnot, you can go back and look at those things. I would appreciate if you would share them, or even these videos, if you would share them with your friends on Facebook, or just share them personally. That'll help grow my channel. This will help you, and it'll help me. And again, I thank you for watching. Have a great day.